For almost 1,000 years, one question has divided historians, nationalists, and ordinary families sitting around dinner tables in Istanbul, Ankara, and small towns scattered across Anatolia. Where do the Turkish people actually come from? Not culturally, not linguistically, biologically, in their blood. It's a question that has been argued about in university lecture halls, fought over in political speeches, and whispered about in family stories passed down for generations. And for most of that time, nobody had a real way to answer it. People had guesses, people had legends, people had theories built on old maps and older assumptions, but nobody could actually open up the biological instruction manual that every human being carries inside every one of their cells and just look. Now, for the first time in history, scientists can do exactly that. They took DNA samples from people across modern Turkey. They took DNA samples from populations scattered across Central Asia, the ancestral homeland of the Turkic-speaking peoples, and they set out to answer a question that had been debated for centuries. If you trace the biological thread all the way back, does Turkish DNA actually match Central Asia the way the history books say it should? What they found didn't just answer the question. It uncovered something stranger. A genetic signal that pointed not toward Central Asia as a whole, but toward one specific population, tucked away in the story of history, that almost nobody outside of specialist researchers has ever heard mentioned by name. Before we get into what the DNA actually showed, it's worth understanding why this question was so loaded in the first place, and why ordinary people believed three very different stories about where they came from, because each of those three stories was believed by millions of people for reasons that made complete sense at the time. The first story is the one most people have heard, and it's the one taught in a simplified form in a lot of classrooms. It goes like this. 1,000 years ago, tribes of horse-riding nomads swept out of the grasslands of Central Asia, the vast, dry, windswept plains stretching from the edges of China to the Caspian Sea, and rode westward in waves, eventually conquering Anatolia, the peninsula we now call Turkey, and settling it completely. Under this story, the modern Turkish population is essentially a transplanted branch of a Central Asian family tree, carried thousands of miles west by conquest, and the people who already lived in Anatolia before that, the Greeks, the Armenians, the Kurds, the many older populations of that land, were largely pushed out, absorbed, or replaced. This story made sense to a lot of people because it lines up with real historical facts. There really were Turkic-speaking tribes who migrated west out of Central Asia. There really was a group called the Oghuz Turks, and out of them came the Seljuk dynasty, who really did defeat the Byzantine Empire at a famous battle in the year 1071, and really did open the door for Turkic-speaking peoples to settle across Anatolia in large numbers over the following centuries. Given all of that, believing that the modern population is simply the biological continuation of those Central Asian migrants isn't a wild guess. It's a completely reasonable read of the history, the kind of story a national identity can be built around with real pride, because it's rooted in something that genuinely happened. The second story is almost the exact opposite, and it was popular among a different group of people for a different set of reasons. This version says that the Turkish conquest of Anatolia was mostly a conquest of language, religion, and rule, not a conquest of population. Under this theory, the vast majority of the people living in Anatolia today are the biological descendants of the exact same populations who lived there for thousands of years before the Seljuks ever arrived. Anatolian farmers, Greek-speaking communities, Armenian communities, and a patchwork of older Anatolian peoples going back to the Hittites and beyond. According to this version, the horse-riding tribes from Central Asia were always a fairly small ruling and warrior class compared to the millions of people already living across the peninsula. And over the centuries that followed, most of the existing population gradually adopted the Turkish language and, in many cases, converted to Islam, without ever being replaced or pushed out biologically. This theory made sense to people who noticed something in daily life that didn't quite fit the nomad conquest story. They looked around Anatolia and saw enormous physical variety, communities that looked more like their neighbors in Greece, Syria, or the Caucasus than like the classic image of a Central Asian steppe rider. To many historians and to many families in Anatolia itself, this felt like the far more believable story, because it matched what people could see with their own eyes when they looked at their neighbors, their cousins, and their own faces in the mirror. The third story is a little uglier, and it's important to be honest about where it came from, because understanding the myth means understanding who invented it and why. In the 1800s and early 1900s, a number of European scholars, working inside a now discredited field sometimes called race science, tried to sort every population on Earth into a small number of supposedly pure racial categories. Inside that flawed and outdated framework, some of these writers invented a category they called the Turanian race, lumping Turks together with a wide range of unrelated Central and East Asian peoples into a single imagined bloodline, often for the specific purpose of arguing that Turkish people were fundamentally separate from, and, in the ugly logic of the time, inferior to, their European neighbors. People who repeated this theory in the 1800s weren't doing careful genetic analysis, because genetic analysis as we know it today didn't exist yet. They were working from skull shapes, skin tone, and rigid invented categories that modern science has since shown don't hold up at all. It's worth naming this theory, honestly, not because anyone respectable still teaches it as science, but because pieces of that old, flawed framework quietly influenced maps, textbooks, and political arguments for more than a century afterward. And some of that old language still echoes today in ways most people don't even realize. So there you have it. 3 completely different stories about where the Turkish people come from, believed sincerely by 3 very different groups of people, for 3 very different reasons. One built on real historical events, one built on lived observation of daily life, and one built on outdated and frankly harmful 19th century pseudoscience. For most of the last 1,000 years, there was no way to settle the argument because nobody had a tool that could look past legend, past politics, and past assumption, and read the actual biological record written inside a living human body. Then geneticists opened up the genome. That's the hinge of this entire story, and it's worth pausing on what that sentence actually means because the word genome gets thrown around a lot without ever being explained. Every single cell in your body contains a long, twisted molecule called DNA, and think of it like an enormous instruction booklet. One so long that if you unrolled the copy inside just one of your cells, it would stretch out to around 2 meters, taller than most adults, even though it's packed into something too small to see without a microscope. That booklet is organized into chapters called genes, and scattered throughout it are tiny individual letters that can differ slightly from person to person. Most of those differences don't do anything noticeable at all. They're like 2 copies of the same book with a handful of typos scattered through thousands of pages, typos that don't change the meaning of the story. But because those tiny differences get copied from parent to child, generation after generation, they leave behind a kind of trail. If 2 groups of people share an unusually large number of the exact same tiny differences in the exact same patterns, that's a strong clue that they share ancestors somewhere back in history. If 2 groups have very different patterns, that's a clue that their ancestors separated a long time ago, or never mixed much at all. This is the basic tool population geneticists use to trace where people's ancestors actually came from, instead of relying on legend, language, or old political maps. Once that tool became available, researchers working in population genetics, but the branch of science that studies how genetic patterns are distributed across different human groups, started doing exactly what you'd expect. They collected DNA samples with full consent from people living across modern Turkey, making sure to include different regions of the country rather than just one city. Then they compared those samples to DNA collected from populations across Central Asia, places like modern Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan, the broad geographic region historically associated with the Oghuz Turks and the wider Turkic migrations. And critically, they also compared Turkish DNA to populations from the regions right around Anatolia itself, Greece, the Balkans, the Caucasus, and parts of the Middle East, the very neighbors the second folk theory pointed to. Studies of this kind have used tools like large public genetic databases that include samples from populations around the world. And researchers have looked both at markers passed down only through the father's line and markers passed down only through the mother's line, as well as broader patterns across the whole genome to build the clearest possible picture. None of this involved guessing or storytelling. It involved literally counting how many of those tiny genetic differences were shared between each pair of populations, and using that count to measure how closely related, statistically speaking, any 2 groups actually are. Here's where the first folk theory runs into trouble, and it's worth walking through why, using a comparison a child could follow. Imagine a city of 1 million people. Now imagine that a group of 20,000 new families moves into that city from somewhere far away. Even if every single one of those new families has children, and their children have children, and so on for several generations, simple math tells you that 20,000 families are never going to genetically overwhelm a city of 1 million existing people. The numbers just don't work that way. A small newcomer population, even after mixing in for centuries, tends to leave a real but modest genetic mark, not a total takeover. Historians studying the actual Seljuk and later Ottoman-era migrations have generally estimated that the number of Turkic-speaking migrants who moved into Anatolia over the relevant centuries, while significant, was almost certainly much smaller than the existing population already living across that huge peninsula at the time. Anatolia wasn't empty land waiting to be filled. It had been home to farming communities, cities, and kingdoms for thousands of years already. So when geneticists actually measured the genetic overlap between modern Turkish populations and Central Asian populations, the pattern that came back didn't look like a full population replacement. It looked much more like what you'd expect from that 20,000 families moving into a city of 1 million scenario. A real, detectable, but relatively modest genetic contribution layered on top of a much larger, much older population that was already there. That same evidence also puts a big dent in the second folk theory, though in a different way. And this is important because the second theory isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. The idea that Anatolia's population is basically unchanged, and that the Turkic migration was pure language and religion change with zero biological mixing, turns out to be too simple as well. If that were completely true, you would expect to find almost no genetic thread connecting Turkish populations to Central Asia at all. The same way, you don't find a strong genetic thread connecting most of Western Europe to Central Asia, because there was never a large-scale migration event linking them, but that's not what the data shows. There is a real, measurable, and consistent genetic signal in Turkish populations that traces back toward Central Asia. Small, but detectable, and too consistent across different studies and different regions of Turkey to be an accident or a fluke. So the truth ends up sitting in between the first two folk stories, rather than matching either one perfectly. The vast majority of the genetic ancestry of people living in Turkey today traces back to populations that were already living in and around Anatolia and the surrounding region for thousands of years before the Seljuks ever arrived, layered together with the descendants of earlier farming populations, Bronze Age populations, and later Byzantine-era communities. But sitting on top of that much larger and older foundation is a real, measurable genetic contribution that does trace back toward Central Asia, exactly the direction history books say the Oghuz Turks came from. And the third folk theory, or the old Turanian race idea from 19th century pseudoscience, simply falls apart the moment you look at the actual data with modern tools. Population geneticists studying human diversity worldwide have found over and over again that there is no clean, isolated Turkic race, or Turanian race, separate from everyone else, any more than there's a single isolated European race, or African race, in the rigid way 19th century writers imagined. Human populations blend into each other gradually across geography, shaped by thousands of years of migration, trade, marriage, and movement, not sorted into neat, separate boxes. Turkish populations, when studied genetically, show close genetic relationships with their actual geographic neighbors, populations in the Caucasus, the Balkans, and parts of the Middle East, which makes total sense because geography and generations of intermarriage, not invented in 19th century racial categories, are what actually shape a population's genetic makeup over time. The old Turanian race theory wasn't describing a real biological pattern. It was inventing one to serve a political argument, and modern genetics simply doesn't back it up. So if you had to summarize where the science actually landed, it would sound something like this. The deep majority of Turkish genetic ancestry connects back to populations that have lived in and around Anatolia, the Caucasus, and the surrounding eastern Mediterranean region for thousands of years. The same broad genetic neighborhood as many of Turkey's modern neighbors. While a smaller but very real genetic thread connects back toward Central Asia, consistent with the historically documented migrations of Turkic-speaking peoples starting around 1,000 years ago. Neither of the first two folk stories was completely right, and neither was completely wrong. And the third story, the old pseudoscientific one, simply isn't supported by any of the modern evidence at all. That, on its own, would already make for a satisfying answer to a 1,000-year-old argument. But it's not actually where this story ends. Because once researchers started looking closer at that smaller Central Asian genetic thread, the real one, the one that actually shows up in the data, they noticed something that almost nobody expected. Here's the twist, and it's the part of this story that even people who've heard the basic outline of Turkish DNA is mostly local, with some Central Asian mixed in, have usually never heard about. When scientists dug into exactly which Central Asian populations that thread connects to most strongly, it didn't spread out evenly across the whole region. It didn't point equally to Kazakh populations, Uzbek populations, Kyrgyz populations, and every other Turkic-speaking group scattered across Central Asia today. Instead, the genetic signal pointed most strongly toward one specific population, the Turkmen people, whose homeland today is mostly in modern Turkmenistan, sitting right along the old historical route. The Oghuz Turks are believed to have traveled on their way west. That detail matters enormously, and here's why. Historians have long known that the specific tribal confederation that eventually produced the Seljuk dynasty, the very group whose victory in 1071 opened the door for Turkic settlement across Anatolia, were the Oghuz Turks. And of all the modern populations of Central Asia, the Turkmen people are widely considered by historians and linguists to be among the most direct cultural and linguistic descendants of those same Oghuz tribes, having largely stayed closer to the ancestral Oghuz homeland, while other Turkic groups spread and mixed in different directions across the wider region over the following centuries. In other words, the genetic thread connecting modern Turkish populations to Central Asia isn't just a vague, generic Central Asian signal. It's a signal that lines up, with striking precision, along the exact historical migration path of one specific tribal group, all the way from a homeland near the Caspian region, across 1,000 years, into the modern population of Turkey. It's the kind of match that feels almost too neat to be real, except it isn't neat because someone designed it that way. It's neat because a very specific historical event involving a very specific group of people really did happen exactly the way old chronicles described it, and DNA, completely independent of any history book, ended up confirming it. But that's not even the strangest part. Because once researchers started asking why that particular genetic signal held together so cleanly across nearly 1,000 years, despite countless generations of intermarriage, migration, empire building, and population movement in every direction across Anatolia and Central Asia in between, they ran into a much harder question that genetics still hasn't fully answered. Why does any distinct ancestral signal survive at all after 1,000 years of mixing? Every generation, a population's genetic makeup gets shuffled and blended a little more, the same way a drop of dye disperses further and further through a glass of water the longer you stir it. After 30 or 40 generations of marriages, migrations, conquests, and everyday human movement across a region as historically busy and interconnected as Anatolia and the surrounding Middle East, you'd expect almost any distinct ancestral signal to blur out almost completely, the same way that drop of dye eventually becomes impossible to see once it's spread evenly through the whole glass. And yet, it hasn't. The signal connecting Turkish populations back to that Oghuz-descended Turkmen population is still detectable today, faint but real, sitting there in the genome like a watermark that refused to fully fade. Population geneticists have a term for one possible explanation for this kind of pattern. They call it a founder effect, which is just a plain way of describing what happens when a relatively small group of ancestors, arriving together and settling together, rather than mixing in immediately and evenly, can leave behind a genetic signature that stays somewhat distinct for many generations afterward, even as the wider population around them grows much larger. But even with that explanation in hand, researchers studying these patterns across many different populations worldwide have noted that exactly how strong, how long-lasting, and how unevenly distributed these ancestral signals end up being can still vary in ways that aren't fully predictable or fully understood, even with the tools available today. In plain language, scientists can explain part of why this signal survived, but not all of it. There's still a piece of this story that genetics alone hasn't finished writing. Think about what all of this actually means for the people living, right now, across modern Turkey. Turkey's population today is well over 80 million people. Every single one of those 80 million people is carrying, somewhere inside every cell of their body, a tiny genetic echo of that 1,000-year-old journey. A journey that started on the steppes near the Caspian Sea, passed through the exact historical events described in old chronicles about the Oghuz Confederation and the Seljuk conquest, and ended up woven into a population that also carries the much older, much larger genetic inheritance of the farmers, traders, and city builders who called Anatolia home for thousands of years before that. Most of those 80 million people will never have their DNA tested. Most of them will go their entire lives never knowing that a small, specific, historically traceable thread runs through their own body, connecting them not just vaguely to Central Asia, but specifically to one identifiable population and one specific chapter of medieval history that most textbooks compress into a single sentence. That's the strange, quiet power of population genetics. It doesn't just answer academic questions in university papers. It reaches directly into the biology of tens of millions of ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, whether they ever find out about it or not. And that raises a question worth sitting with after this video ends. If a signal this specific, this old, and this improbable can survive quietly inside the DNA of 80 million people for nearly 1,000 years, hiding in plain sight until modern science finally had the tools to notice it, what else is still sitting there, unexamined, inside populations all over the world, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question? There are dozens of populations across the planet with origin stories, every bit as tangled, every bit as argued over, and every bit as unresolved as this one was before geneticists opened up the genome and finally looked. Somewhere out there is another population carrying its own version of that Turkmen thread, a specific, traceable connection to one particular ancestral group, hidden inside a much larger, much more general story that everyone assumed was already fully explained. We're going to keep finding them, one population at a time. And when we do, we'll bring you the story exactly the way we brought you this one. Not with guesses, not with legends, but with what the DNA actually says. Next week, we're tracing a population whose ancestors were declared culturally extinct by historians more than 2,000 years ago. And yet, according to the genetic record, they never actually disappeared at all. They've just been hiding inside a population nobody ever thought to check. If a story like that sounds like the kind of hidden history you want uncovered before anyone else tells you about it, subscribe now, because that video is coming soon. And before you go, drop a comment and tell us, did your own family ever pass down an origin story like one of the three we talked about today? A nomad legend, we never really left story, or something else entirely? We'd genuinely like to know how many of these old family stories turn out to be closer to the truth than anyone expected. Let's take a step back for a moment, because it's worth understanding a little more about how researchers actually do this kind of comparison, since the process itself is almost as interesting as the result. When population geneticists want to measure how closely related two groups of people are, they're not just eyeballing physical appearance or relying on where people happen to live today. They collect genetic samples, usually through a simple, painless cheek swab or a small blood sample, always with informed consent from every participant. And then they run that genetic material through sequencing machines that can read out millions of individual points along a person's DNA. From there, statisticians and geneticists working together look for patterns across those millions of data points, using mathematical tools designed specifically to measure genetic distance between populations. One of the most basic ideas behind this kind of analysis is simple to understand, even without any scientific background. If you take any two random people from the same population, they'll share a certain number of these tiny genetic differences just by chance, because all humans share the overwhelming majority of their DNA with each other, regardless of ancestry. After all, we're all one species. But if you take two random people from populations that separated from each other a long time ago and didn't mix much afterward, the pattern of shared and unshared genetic differences will look measurably different from what you'd see comparing two people from the same population. Do this across thousands of individuals and millions of genetic markers, average it all together, and you end up with a number, often visualized as a kind of family tree or a map, that tells you, in a very rigorous, repeatable way, how closely related on average one population is to another. This is the exact kind of analysis that let researchers say, with real confidence, that Turkish populations show a stronger, more specific genetic connection to Turkmen populations than to other Central Asian groups, rather than just guessing based on geography or old maps. It's also worth pausing to explain something that trips a lot of people up when they first hear about studies like this, because it's easy to walk away with the wrong impression. When scientists say that most of the genetic difference between any two individual people anywhere in the world comes down to them simply being two different people, not their ethnicity, not their nationality, not their ancestry group. That's not a small footnote. It's one of the most consistently repeated findings in all of modern human genetics. The vast majority of genetic variation exists between individuals within the same population, not between different populations as a whole. In plain terms, two random people from the same city, the same family, or the same ethnic background can carry more genetic differences between them than the average difference between two entire populations on opposite sides of the world. This matters here because it means that when researchers talk about a population having a genetic connection to Central Asia or to Anatolia or to anywhere else, they're never talking about some rigid, uniform genetic stamp that every single person in that group carries in exactly the same way. They're talking about a statistical pattern, a tendency that shows up clearly when you average across thousands of people, even though any two individuals within that same population might look, genetically, quite different from each other in plenty of other ways. This is exactly why the old 19th century idea of neatly sorting entire peoples into rigid racial categories was scientifically broken from the start. Real human genetic variation simply doesn't work that way, and it never did. Now, let's go back even further than the Oghuz migration for a moment, because there's another layer to this story worth understanding, one that helps us explain why Anatolia had such a large, well-established population for the incoming Turkic tribes to blend into in the first place. Long before anyone spoke Turkish anywhere near Anatolia, that peninsula was already one of the most continuously inhabited regions on the entire planet. Some of the earliest known farming communities anywhere in the world took root in and around Anatolia and the surrounding region thousands of years before recorded history even began. And over the millennia that followed, wave after wave of different peoples moved through, settled, mixed, and left their own genetic mark. Bronze Age kingdoms, Iron Age civilizations, Hellenistic Greek settlement following the conquests of Alexander the Great, Roman rule, and then many centuries as the heartland of the Byzantine Empire, itself a direct continuation of Rome in the east, with a population made up of Greek-speaking communities, Armenian communities, and many other groups who had called that land home for generation after generation. By the time the Seljuk Turks arrived in the 11th century, they weren't riding into empty land. They were moving into one of the oldest, most densely settled, most genetically layered regions on the planet, which is exactly why the math worked out the way it did. A relatively modest number of incoming Turkic-speaking migrants, however historically significant their arrival was, could never have genetically overwhelmed a population with that many thousands of years of continuous settlement already behind it. Instead, over the following centuries, intermarriage, conversion, and cultural blending gradually spread the Turkish language and Islamic faith across almost the entire peninsula, even as the deeper genetic roots of most of the population stayed tied to that much older Anatolian and Eastern Mediterranean foundation. This is actually a pattern population geneticists have found again and again in population after population all over the world. And it's worth naming clearly because it reframes the entire question in a way that makes the Turkish case feel a lot less like an isolated mystery and a lot more like one example of something universally human. Language, religion, and culture can spread across a population extremely quickly, sometimes within just a handful of generations, especially when they're carried by a politically or militarily dominant group, the way Turkish language and Islam spread across Anatolia following the Seljuk and later Ottoman periods. But genetic ancestry, the actual biological inheritance passed down cell by cell from parent to child, tends to move much, much more slowly, and it tends to reflect the deeper, longer, messier history of who actually had children with whom, generation after generation, long before anyone was thinking about drawing neat lines on a map. This is exactly why you can have a population that speaks a language that arrived from thousands of miles away, practices a religion that arrived from thousands of miles away, and yet still carries a genetic ancestry that is, in its largest share, rooted firmly in the land its ancestors already occupied long before either of those things ever showed up. It's not a contradiction, it's simply how human history actually tends to work. Almost everywhere researchers have looked closely enough to check. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth mentioning before we close things out, because it adds an extra layer to the twist we talked about earlier. Researchers studying Central Asian populations more broadly have also noted that the region itself has an incredibly long and complicated history of its own, with waves of different peoples moving through it in multiple directions over thousands of years, not just Turkic-speaking groups moving west toward Anatolia, but earlier populations moving east, west, north, and south across the same vast landscape for millennia before that. This means that Central Asia was never a single uniform genetic starting point to begin with. It was already a patchwork of different populations, shaped by its own long internal history, by the time the Oghuz Confederation formed and eventually sent branches westward toward Anatolia, while other branches, including the ancestors of today's Turkmen population, stayed closer to home. Understanding that helps explain why the genetic signal connecting modern Turkish populations to Central Asia wasn't spread out evenly across every Central Asian group. It was concentrated specifically around the population most closely tied, historically and genetically, to the exact branch of the Oghuz Confederation that actually made the journey west, which is precisely the kind of fine-grained, historically specific detail that only modern genetic analysis, and not old maps or old legends, could ever have revealed with this much precision. So where does that leave the original 1,000-year-old argument? It leaves it resolved, but resolved in a more interesting way than any of the three original folk theories predicted on their own. The people of modern Turkey are not simply transplanted Central Asian nomads the way the first story claimed. They are not simply unchanged descendants of ancient Anatolia who only ever changed their language the way the second story claimed. And they are absolutely not members of some separate, isolated Turanian race, the way the flawed 19th century theory claimed. Instead, the real answer, the one written directly into the genome, rather than into any political argument, is something richer than any single legend could have captured on its own. A population whose deep genetic roots trace back thousands of years into Anatolia and the surrounding eastern Mediterranean and Caucasus region, carrying within it a smaller but very real and remarkably specific genetic thread connecting back across 1,000 years and thousands of miles to one particular Central Asian population, tied to one particular medieval migration that historians had already written about in old chronicles long before anyone had the tools to check whether the biology actually backed the story up. And it does, almost perfectly. That's the part of this story that deserves to be remembered above everything else. For nearly 1,000 years, this question sat in the space between history, politics, and legend, with no reliable way to settle it. It took modern genetic science, careful sampling, honest researchers, and a willingness to look at the actual data rather than defend a preferred version of the story, to finally connect a modern population of 80 million people to one specific, historically documented ancestral group across 1,000 years of migration, conquest, mixing, and change. And even now, with that mystery resolved, a smaller, stranger question remains sitting quietly underneath it. Why that particular genetic thread survived at all, thin but intact, through 1,000 years that should have blurred it away completely. Genetics has answered a lot of questions in this story. It hasn't answered all of them, and maybe that's exactly why stories like this one are worth telling in the first place. Not because they wrap up neatly, but because every time science gets a little better at reading the story written inside us, it turns out there's always one more layer buried just beneath the one we thought was the final answer. It also helps to understand that the Turkish case isn't some strange, one-of-a-kind exception in the story of human populations. Once you know what to look for, you start noticing the same basic pattern showing up again and again in places most people would never expect. Take the Hungarians, for example. Hungarian is a language completely unrelated to almost every other language spoken in Europe, and Hungarian national history tells a proud story about ancestors who rode in from the steppes far to the east, many centuries ago, in a series of migrations led by tribal chieftains whose names are still taught in Hungarian schools today. And yet, when researchers looked at the genetic ancestry of the modern Hungarian population using the same basic tools used in the Turkish study, they found something remarkably similar to what we just walked through. A population whose deep genetic roots trace mostly back to the European populations already living in and around the Carpathian Basin long before those steppe migrations ever happened, with a smaller but real and traceable genetic thread connecting back toward the east, toward the population that actually carried the Hungarian language into Europe in the first place. Language moved fast, biology moved slow. The same story, almost word for word, just wearing a different national costume. Once you see that pattern in one place, it becomes hard to unsee it everywhere else, and it should make anyone pause the next time they hear a population's origin story told as a single, simple, unbroken bloodline running back thousands of years in one direction. Real human history almost never works that cleanly, and every time scientists have had the tools to actually check, the true picture has turned out to be layered, mixed, and far more interesting than the simplified version taught in any single classroom.